It's Friday, November 13th, 2009, and it's got to be 4:20 somewhere in the world. I'm your host, Radical Russ Belville. Produced and distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C., this is your NORML Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about our show at our website, stash.norml.org, and continue the education and conversation on our blog as well. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. The podcasting and blogging technology for the NORML Daily Audio Stash is provided by Red Aphid Interactive Media. For your professional web design needs, visit redaphid.com. Good day, Stashers, and welcome to the podcast. This is going to be a special edition of the NORML Daily Audio Stash, in that I moderated a panel today at the International Drug Policy Reform Conference here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I want to give you the exclusive first hear of that panel that we put together. It was a lot of fun. Alan St. Pierre was on the panel, the executive director of NORML, of course, and Rubin Whitmore was on the panel. He's a filmmaker with the FlexYourRights.org organization. They're the folks that put together the Busted video, and he's the filmmaker who has just made the sequel to that called 10 Rules for Dealing with Police. They were screening that here in Albuquerque, and unfortunately I didn't get a chance to see it, but I'm sure we'll be getting a copy of it soon. Then also Deborah Small from Break the Chains. That's an organization in New York City that is working on harm reduction in various areas there in New York, in addition to marijuana policy as well as needle exchange and so on. And then there was a fellow who was very interesting to meet. His name was William Lantelme. He's from Brazil, and he's an activist down there who's been putting together the global marijuana marches, in addition to being the man behind growroom.net. And he's talking about the fledgling Brazil culture, cannabis culture, where they're, severely curtailed and arrested for even, mentioning wanting to change cannabis laws. So that, as you can imagine, makes running a march quite difficult. So it's always fun to learn from people that are in other countries. And the one thing about this drug policy forum that they had was the international nature of it. I really appreciated getting to meet people from Brazil and the Netherlands. People came from all over to talk drug policy, and it's always interesting to hear what is going on in other countries. Coming up next week on the Daily Audio Stash, I'll have some clips from the plenary session that took place today at the Drug Policy Forum. And this had gentlemen from Australia, a gentleman from New York who's working on issues there, and then also and I think he was from Mexico. I hope I'm not getting the country wrong, but spoke on Latin American and South American drug policy. So very, very fascinating. We'll have some of that audio next week on the Stash, as well as other panels, including a panel that featured, it was amazing, Paul Armentano, Dale Geiringer, Frank Lucido, Philippe Lucas, Dr. Carl Hart, who am I forgetting? But we'll get that one on as well. And there was some pretty contentious debate as far as a panel goes on some issues, a little bit of disagreement. It'll be great listening. So stay tuned to the upcoming Daily Audio Stashes. We'll get that all downloaded for you. I want to thank Dr. Ethan Nadelman and Stephen Gutwillig and Derek and all the people from DPA who took me out to this conference, and also all the people who donate to NORML that helped to fund me getting here. It's been an amazing past 90 days with all the travel I've been doing and meeting so many people from around this country, and I'm very proud to be bringing it to you here on the Daily Audio Stash. So here it is. It's our panel from the Drug Policy Alliance International Drug Policy Reform Conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Marijuana's Cultural Moment, moderated by me, Radical Russ Belville. Thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Paul Stanford from the Hemp and Cannabis Foundation, or THCF. Medical marijuana is legal in 13 states today, and THCF has clinics in 8 of those states. Our doctors help qualified patients obtain an authorization for medical marijuana in their state. Patients are eligible for medical marijuana with a history of either severe chronic pain and or nausea, cancer, AIDS or HIV, hepatitis, glaucoma, seizure disorders like epilepsy, chronic muscle spasms such as multiple sclerosis or asthma, neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, and gastrointestinal disorders like IBS or Crohn's disease. If you or someone you know has one of these conditions, our doctors will help you obtain a permit for medical marijuana. THCF Medical Clinics has offices in Washington State, Oregon, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada, Montana, and now Michigan. Call 1-800-723-0188 or go to the web at hemp.org or 1-800-723-0188.
We begin the panel on marijuana's cultural moment with Deborah Small from the Break the Chains Foundation in New York. She introduces her presentation with a short quotation and then moves on to the discussion.
Reefer is a habit forming. All perverts may not be marijuana smokers, but practically all marijuana smokers are perverts. And this was a statement that was made by the head of the Narcotics Enforcement Bureau in 1949, and it pretty much represented the way our government saw this issue and the people who were using pot. And then here we are this year, 50 years.
At this point, Deborah Small presented many clips from various media, including Sex and the City, when Carrie Bradshaw was busted with a joint, interviews with the cast and crew from the show Weeds, interview with Snoop Dogg about being on Weeds, some clips from the movie Friday, and so on, to demonstrate the pervasiveness of marijuana in pop media culture. After that show concluded, she concluded her remarks, and then we began to have the roundtable discussions.
I think that these images are permeating the media. They're saying a lot about where we are, but they're happening in the backdrop of increasing arrest and the continuing sort of delineation between the okay marijuana smokers and the not so okay marijuana smokers. And so I think the question still remains whether or not what we're looking at is a real shift in the culture or a temporary thing. And I don't know which way it's going to go. I think only time will tell, but I wanted to sort of present this as hopefully something that might spark some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think given all the clips we've seen and so much media portrayal of marijuana in the culture, that it would be natural for me to turn to Rubin here. And as you were looking at that, I saw you were taking a lot of notes on the issues. And as you see those portrayals in the popular media, you know, even dating back to the Cheech and Chong movies, how do you see that as shaping or affecting not only just our marijuana culture, but the view of marijuana from the outside world, the people we need to convince that it's time to re-legalize this plant?
Yeah, excuse me. Can I have one real quick thing? Niall, are you in here? Okay. I lost my daughter for a second, so you can understand. I haven't seen her since the lights went off. There we go. All right, so I apologize. That was my moment of panic for a father. Like, where is my daughter? Yeah, I guess I should know this rule. I was hearing it regularly. My approach to media and how it really works for what we're doing is to, first of all, frame it in a certain way, because most everybody in here has their predisposition. That's clear. But I almost kind of want to back up a little bit and say we're in a capitalist society. And we all know this, but that's really crucial when identifying how media is going to portray anything. Because the reason why media can support alcohol is because there's an industry that's very public that can lobby behind it and stick behind it. Well, media can't support marijuana in the same way because there's not anybody paying its bills, like advertising. And it's interesting because I'm kind of like trying to figure out how I want to address this group in the sense of my heart lies in media of all sorts. Like, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a media maker. I make documentaries, I make music videos, I make narrative projects. but I also am a scholar of media, meaning I study the media's impact on society. So one of the biggest culprits is news, and that's how it was started when Deborah showed the news. And I'm like, you really have to frame this. You really have to understand that imagine a triangle, and in the triangle on one side is the consumer, the person who takes in the media. And on the other side of it, there's three-sides triangle. On the second side, there's the media maker, a person such as myself. Then there's these people who study it, and they give you all their opinions. In the middle is this elusive, invisible item that's probably the most crucial. It's the machine that gives it to you. Now, this can apply to any type of media, but I'm just using it for the sake of ours. We're talking about news, but you could apply it to a book. You don't really get mad at the publisher of a book. You get mad at the author. But who's making the most money? The publisher. You don't really get mad at on what goes on in the inner city. You have an opinion about it, but you're getting it because of a news organization says, this is how we make money. And it's like a balancing act, because on one side, we have this issue of how can we get it legalized. And I'm like, you can go what I've really been promoting while I've been here is passive media is probably the most effective for what we're trying to accomplish. You're just trying to change popular opinion, make pop culture think it's okay. And not that it isn't okay, but just get them on the side of logic. Because if you make it a frontline attack, which is something I've been speaking on a lot, is everybody is so confrontational. Like, we need to change policy. We need to do this. We need to do that. I'm like, well, there are people who are set up against you who are not going to let that just happen conveniently. One of the observations was tobacco industry. They did not like a lot of things going into place that prevented them from making money. Well, if you start taking away alcohol money to give to some other organization or some other industry, you're going to create problems. So they have a foothold on it, because I actually think alcohol is way worse than marijuana. And for those who didn't hear anything about me last night, I'm a square. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't get high. I'm actually a square. But I have an opinion. And my opinion is like, wow, way more crazy things happen with alcohol. I have a lot of friends around me who smoke marijuana regularly. And they're not nearly as funny as this stuff. They're real normal. Their munchies aren't excessive. They're just normal. And I watch them smoke a lot of weed. And I'm like, where's all this comedy? But it's just normal to them. And that's so wild to me. So I kind of like jumped around in a couple of things, but what I'm going to focus on just to kind of bring some attention to. If you can see this triangle and you see makers are over here, and then there's people who watch it, and there's people who talk about it. In the middle is this machine. And if you're really trying to change the dynamics, you got to figure out where you stand with the problem. Are you trying to be passive, or are you trying to be active? If you're trying to be passive, then the first thing I can offer to you is to make you aware of it. You have to realize there is a machine in place. And I know I'm speaking to an audience that's very savvy, but it's like media literacy is the funniest thing, because most people never take into account the machine that brought them the information in the first place. They tend to take into account well, Weeds is a great show. I'm like, Weeds is just a device for that company to make money. They'll put anything out there if it does what? Makes them money. If they can get either advertisers to spend money on it, or if they themselves have figured out how to make money. Now, because that's the reality of it, to me the easiest way to make the change is to make the viewer the most comfortable person with the outcome. So that way they can keep watching it and it's not a big deal. But right now, weed is under the radar, creating a false reality. I'm like, it's really under the radar, but it's normative. It's not even a false reality. It's somebody's normal, everyday existence. So I kind of had to set this stage, because I feel like I'm the one guy in the room who's like, I really don't have the big opinion about we need to make change, we need to make change. No, I tend to have the opinion we need to use media as a tool for your change. If everybody in this room has a goal and objective, I promise you media is one of the most effective tools you can have to get to that goal and objective. You can find a group of like-minded people all day, but at some point you're going to have to come, 1, 2, 3, 4 video cameras in this room. Nobody's going to know what happens in this room without these devices sending it to the masses. Now, this is a preaching to the choir type room, so, it'll find its way to the people that already support it. But if there's that anti-person out there, they need to see weed like they see hybrid cars being portrayed by Ford, or how fashion designers portray the next style. It's so matter of fact. But do you not realize there's so many millions of dollars put into those images to make it so non-existent? Like, am I making sense? It's like, it's so passive that it's so purposeful. There's nothing accidental about it. I mean, ad agencies spend millions of dollars on the same thing you guys spend money on, where they're like, we have focus groups and public policy and polls, and yeah, they know exactly what the sensibilities are. We can't do that because it's not legal. But the passive side is, if you make shows like Weeds, which I kind of giggle at because I'm like, everybody tends to make marijuana operate off of comedy and humor. And I'm actually not that type of logic. I'm like, you really need to make marijuana look like your mom and your pastor and the gas guy and just real normal people who aren't doing really, really funny stuff. Because then you kind of like make it, oh, that's sensationalized versions of it. But it doesn't have to be. It could just be a normal existence. And then it becomes acceptable. So, did I go off on a tangent too far?
Fantastic.
I mean, this is what I'm passionate about, as you can tell, because I'm like, we're here because of media. And I went to the one earlier, what is it, on marijuana's messaging in society, something about messaging. And that one was even more enthralling because, like, a gentleman said early on, he was like, you know, there's a story about an elderly couple using weed to enhance their sex life. And I was like, damn, that's a really good passive story. Like, you don't have to have any advocacy group to support you in that, because that just sounds like a good story, right? Like an elderly couple struggling with their relationship, and somehow or another the solution or conflict might be weed. And nobody ever says, this is a comedy, or this is the focus, or there's a bust. It's just they're trying to find love at an advanced age, and it's sentimental, and it's terms of endearment, and wow. But you would remember it 20 years from now. These campaigns, I'm going to shoot myself because I make a living doing media, but I'm like, a commercial, who remembers commercials 20 years later?
Some of them.
But you remember a lot more movies.
Yes.
And who remembers the PSAs and the marketing campaigns? You might remember some of them, but for the most part, you can remember a good movie.
Yes.
You know, however it piqued your interest. And it could be the lowest budget movie, like Friday, example. $3 million movie, considered incredibly low budget. Not low budget in the reality world, but Hollywood's version of low budget. But it's a classic. And it works effectively of introducing people to a life, like he said, some brilliant shit that was real soundbite-ish. You know, so I really want to kind of like give the opportunity for the people around me to define, are we really trying to make this a passive argument of how media is to be portrayed, or an active? Because I think active is the news. If you're mad at the news, you really can't be. They make a living off of advertising. You know, communities of color that are affected by a lot of this stuff are not the intended audience of your average news network. So you're really not, to me, you shouldn't expect them to care about the inner city. That's not who's paying their bills. They pump information to the suburbs. So they want to keep their advertising dollar in place. I'm just putting it out there as like identify where the problems are before you get into that, like, well, it's slanted. It's not really slanted, it's a business. And I can say that because I'm in it. Like, I can genuinely say that. It's just a business. I love my industry, but it's a business. So if we can like make that differentiation between, is this like a passive pursuit of how to change it, and is media being favorable because it's now showing a couple of good shows, or is it that there's a trend where all of society is supporting something new, and you might see it permeate across the area, the full thing? Is that?
No, that's great. Thank you, Rubin.
I'm sorry.
That is a lot to think about. And, he brings up the fact of all the pop movies you could think of off the top of your head. If I asked you to name 5, they'd be comedies for the most part. I did get the chance this year, working on the stash, to review a movie, and it's killing me that I can't remember the name of it. I don't know how that might have happened. It was it was about a young man who was going to a psychologist who...
With Kevin Spacey.
No, it wasn't the Kevin Spacey one. It was another one. The Whackness. Thank you. A movie called The Whackness, where marijuana was a big part of the movie, but it wasn't. It was just part of the scenery. It was really more about the people and their everyday, average sort of lives. There was another one where the guy goes out to. Anyway, there's just a lot of movies out there, but they don't seem to get the play that the comedy movies do. And I'm wondering if that might have something to do with how cannabis-themed movies might appeal differently to those of us in the movement versus those of us outside the movement. Something to think about, and I'm glad you brought that up. And also, you made the mention of this being a capitalist society. And I wanted to show you something about capitalism. There's a little lighter leash, little thing a lot of people know. This gets sold in hemp fests all over the place. Inside it is a lighter from my lawyer, John Lucy, that has your rights. I probably do not want to be searched, and then has his number on the other side, and a little device that hooks onto the lighter for poking out your little bowl. So, talk about capitalist society. I think cannabis consumers may be the most capitalistic people I've ever met in some respects, to think of little things like this. Anyhow, I want to move on to Alan St. Pierre, Executive Director of NORML, and in the clips that Deborah showed us, of course, there was the View discussion on Michael Phelps and that whole situation. Just recently, we've seen Tim Lincecum from the San Francisco Giants, the pitcher, all-star pitcher, pop for weed just north of where I live in Portland, Oregon. So I was wondering if you could address the notion of these high-profile sports athletes being busted with weed and how that affects the mainstream culture's perception of who and what we are, and does that, in the long term, help us to overturn prohibition?
Thank you all. Deborah, thank you for doing the high-tech presentation. I'm completely tucked in. Almost every one of those, NORML, specifically myself, was a script consultant. I've probably been a script consultant to 40 to 45 shows since 1992. There have been that many shows that have looked at mainly medical cannabis. That's been the narrative that the producers are comfortable relating to. Going back to Rubin's extremely important fulcrum point about capitalism, the men and women that are the producers of Weeds and these other shows are risking tens of millions of dollars when they put these shows out there. So they had to be cajoled that their capital was going to get a return, and the IRS and the DEA wasn't going to be knocking on the door. So while culture is such a huge topic, and Russ has tasked me with one narrow discussion point here, in my limited time here, I'm going to try to talk about many aspects of cannabis and culture. Athletes are held in such high regard in our society. Many of them wrongly so, but they are. From Greek times forward, the athlete is held in great, great regard. So it's shocking when a Mark Stepnoski retires with his beautiful diamond-encrusted Super Bowl rings and top 100 players of the century, and comes out and says, I used marijuana while I was in the NFL. I'm a big believer and supporter of reform. It's reported that 60 to 70% of the NBA athletes use marijuana. So every single week in the world, certainly every month in the United States, a high-profile athlete gets arrested. Whether you're a rugby player in Australia, whether you're a hockey player in Canada, or whether you're a baseball player crossing the border from Oregon to Washington. So that crystallizes a discussion around who uses it, what's the effect on their lives. I mean, when we go back and look at the debate 2 or 3 years ago when the NBA wanted to, quote, crack down on its players who were using marijuana, the question had to be begged over and over again, what are the ill effects? And we spoke, NORML, myself, Paul Armentano, and others spoke to NBA union officials and their medical professionals. What argument could the NBA make? These are the greatest athletes on earth, one could argue. Their stamina is remarkable. And yet, the argument was, at its base, they could be even better if they didn't use marijuana. How many of us have heard that in our lives? Right, Mom? And another one of Rubin's points, very well taken. As I mentioned before, almost all of the 40 to 45 stoner movies, as they're known, and the 30 to 40 shows that have had marijuana as a theme or a narrative, all of them have been mainly predicated on comedy. So we know that we have moved when we see the narrative go beyond comedy, and we're starting to see that more and more. How many of you saw Law and Order last week? Wow, are we that?
We prosecute a bunch.
Yeah. Well, another one of those tea leaves, but again, predicated on the narrative of medical marijuana. Last week in Law and Order, a captain who's a female has breast cancer or something to this effect, and her husband and her son encouraged her to use medical marijuana, got her some. She refused to use it, of course, as a police captain. She left, and you then get the feeling pretty strongly she used marijuana. She then goes to the precinct, and people are like, she smells like marijuana. She gets drawn into the captain's office, into the commander's office, and says, you smell like marijuana. And she says, well, I have cancer. I'm using it for medical purposes. And this is not predicated on a state where it's legal. And the captain reaches into his drawer and he pulls mints out. He said, I suggest you use mints and perfume. Now, at NORML, we can measure litigation, and we do every day. You win or you lose. You can measure your legislation. You advance it or you don't. But these tea leaves, they really are remarkable. How many of them come over the bow every single day? Now, when I talk to people who are 65 and older, and I say 420. Mystery. 420 under 30 years old, ubiquity. Does anybody in this room not know what 420 is, or at least what it's supposed to mean? It's kind of amorphous, but does anybody here absolutely, thank you, because, thank you. 420, April 20th, 4:20 in the afternoon. What's that?
In the morning.
In the morning, yes. It does happen twice a day, I'm told, just like the tide. When High Times magazine, and I'll get to High Times in a moment, because High Times is a major purveyor of the culture here, to be sure. Glossy magazines, capitalism. In 1991-92, they published some letters talking about some students at San Rafael College who were claiming that they were, rather than take tea or whatnot, that between their intramural sports and having to eat that terrible institutional food you get in college, that they primed their appetites and smoked pot. Now, that won't be a big surprise to many of us who grew up in the 1980s or 90s. But this became so culturalized that by, I think, 1994-95, I was at the Cannabis Cup Awards, and Steve Hagar drew about 70 people out at 4:20 a.m. for some huge drum circle in the middle of Amsterdam. And I thought, this is the most insane thing. I can't believe it. This is stupid. And 2 years later, I found myself on NPR having to explain what 420 was, and I thought, well, that must be it. That's it. That's the cultural zenith. We're talking about it on NPR. That was 1998 on the show Anthem. 420 is so commercialized now. Many of you will probably recognize that two entire networks, G4 and Spike TV, now literally run 420 specials. Capitalism meeting culture. This is our fulcrum. And the weight is definitely shifted in favor of reform and the tolerance here, I think, frankly, because the baby boomers are running our institutions at this juncture. That's just the simple demographic changes we're all living through. My grandparents are no longer running those institutions. My mother, who's 64, is. I'm 44 years old. So 420 is a remarkable day. It's usually our most prodigious spike in our web page traffic. We pick up last year 1,900 members on one day. 420 is a classic example of the normalization, to use a bad pun here, but it's the sociological term, the normalization of cannabis use. And of course we have weed heroes. Snoop, Woody, Willie, Bill. I don't even have to mention their last names, do I? These people are so accepted as weed warriors in the mainstream. And they had to play it kind of edgy in those early years, but no longer. Bill doesn't. Bill's as full-throated as you can get. Sometimes too much so. And I speak about rallies. It was mentioned about hempfests. And I'm speaking now from the context of a Drug Policy Alliance conference. And we are here looking at the totality of drugs. But we have to be clear. There is no normalization or culturalization around so-called hard drugs outside of psychedelics, which are not hard drugs. There's a reason why there's no heroin times. If you think about it, the movies in our lifetimes that have depicted hard drug use, it's a pretty bleak narrative as compared to that upbeat, stoner, friendly, comedic one. Non-threatening, to be sure. And these rallies are remarkable. Who here has not been to the Seattle Hemp Festival? All of you should carve out part of your blessed time off that you get. Go to Seattle in that third week of August and get into that crowd of 150 some odd thousand people a day that are in Myrtle Edwards Park. It's remarkable. And our drug czar, Mr. Kurlikowski, oversaw the world's largest open smoke-in and paraphernalia exposition for 4 or 5 years with little or no arrests. And now he is the drug czar. A couple of weeks ago, one of the first times ever happened in the 18, 19 years I've been at NORML, the drug czar invited NORML and other groups to meet with him. So I think that the culture of the Seattle Hemp Fest, the culture of I-75 and passing a decriminalization initiative, lowest law enforcement priority as they're known. Medical marijuana has made our drug czar very pragmatic on this. He's not a legalizer. He's not a decriminalizer, I can assure you. But he's pragmatic on this. Cannabis cups. I mean, the fact that this is now branded. High Times has to go around the world threatening people. Some in this room have probably been threatened with lawsuits if you use cannabis cup. It's now a brand. TV shows, as I mentioned, so many of them over the years. I mean, Murphy Brown sparked a national debate. It sparked Dan Quayle effectively debating for the second time a fictional character. And one of my concerns with drug policy reform groups, particularly some of my fellow marijuana reform groups, is trying to divorce themselves from this very culture. The idea that you can be pro-reform and anti-marijuana is completely incongruent. Women couldn't divorce themselves from being women during suffrage. Blacks couldn't divorce themselves from the culture of being black. And gay and lesbians, even with a drag queen leading the parade, cannot divorce themselves from their culture. And we can't either, nor should we. We've had some great debates at Seattle Hemp Fest and other places about stoner stupid and using words like cannabis and marijuana versus weed and medipot. And we get almost to fisticuffs over some of these discussions. The culture's so important and so deep. Cannabis tourism. It exists, obviously, in the United States. Many of us have said, what am I going to do for my free time? I'm going out, as I just suggested, to engage in cannabis tourism. Many of us did it in the 80s and 90s in the Netherlands to experience genuine cannabis freedom and to be like the mini Marco Polos to come back to the United States and say, this is what I saw. It was amazing. And I will, again, let you know that last week, the Minister of Justice from the Netherlands invited NORML and other groups to meet with her. And she had a couple of important messages. Number one, as much as we read headlines today about restrictions in the Netherlands around coffee shops as they're known, she made it clear, no. They're not shutting these places down. They're rezoning them. They're moving them away from the border. They're getting them out of the red light district in Amsterdam. They're not taking away one license. She said, we're simply going to rezone and be, as best we can, an EU partner. The other thing she wanted to relate to us was, and I could see the vexation in her eyes going back to the idea of commerciality. She realizes, why would I go to the Netherlands when I can go to Amsterdam, when I can go to Vancouver, when I can go to the LA Basin, and for all intents and purposes, engage in cannabis freedom? And she was really vexed by this, the idea that she realizes there's no reason for us to go and spend $1,000 or $2,000 to spend a week in the Netherlands when we can do that right here in the United States. And so she wanted to make it clear to NORML and the other groups that the green light is still on. And I'll wind down here by the fact that I see other great tea leaves for the fact that mainstream advertisers come to NORML all the time wanting to go on NORML's webpage, and we have, for all intents and purposes, a commercial-free page. ESPN's X Games contacted NORML a couple of weeks ago and wants NORML to advertise at the X Games. Now you can see why. I mean, that makes kind of obvious sense, does it not? X Games, NORML. I had to do an MSNBC show the other day. And again, one of these goofy things about culture. So people from NORML often wear these gold marijuana lapel pins. And so after I got done with the show, the amount of producers and camera people, including people barking in my ear from New York, are all like, where can I get one of those pins? Where can I get one of those pins? And then I come out in the green room, I'm not going to mention names, but a number of rather famous pundits are all sitting in the green room waiting for their turn to go on to these individual shows. And they all, to a person, many of them quite conservative, where can I get one of those pins? Where can I get one of those pins? Again, just kind of funny how those things work out. And I think my final point here is for 2010, I think one of the great shifts in culture is going to be women really at the fore of marijuana law reform in the next year to year and a half. NORML is launching the NORML Women's Alliance in the next few weeks. There is a number of major stories coming out in the Washington Post and other glossy publications and documentaries that are being filmed right now with women from the ages of 90 years old, Ruthie Bergner, anybody who's ever met Ruthie, down to, I think, Sasha Sagan, Carl Sagan's daughter, has been interviewed. It's sort of an amazing range. And so for me, I've always felt that when minorities and women get more involved in this movement, and particularly women, we know we're going to have the major reforms that we've all been seeking. So with that, I'd like to wrap it up and just thank everybody for coming out to this amazing conference. This is being well covered all around the United States and the world. The reporters that I've been talking to the last couple of days are all like, I can't reach anybody. Everybody seems to be in Albuquerque. So thank you for your commitment for doing all of this.
I wanted to touch briefly on a couple of things that Alan brought up, just the nexus of culture and capitalism with regards to the Michael Phelps case. It's something that I do as part of my presentation that I did at the NORML conference. When the Michael Phelps thing broke, which, by the way, happened on my birthday, thank you. When that thing broke, there's a company called Vano, and they track the Q ratings of companies, of brands, of how well accepted they are, how well known they are, family friendly, etc. And of 5,600 brands that Vano tracked at that time, when Michael Phelps was their spokes guy and everything, and before the whole story had broken, the company Kellogg's ranked 9th out of 5,600. 9th out of 5,600. As of 2 days ago, when I last looked it up on the internet, they now rank 312th. Okay? So a precipitous drop in popularity, which just, goes to prove the adage that if you make Pop-Tarts, Cheez-Its, and other such, stoner snacks, don't go messing with the stoners. We'll take you down. And the other thing, too, is that if you look at a six-week stock chart of Kellogg's stock prices, they traded at $45 a share at the moment that it happened. 6 weeks later, they had dropped 20% to $36 a share. So that's why I always look at the Michael Phelps incident as being, yeah, haha, it was funny, he got busted. No, this kind of was a shot across the bow of corporate America as to this big, huge, unknown pool of consumers out there that actually have some pull. When they don't like what you do, they will let you know it.
A color, Russ, to that, of course, if anybody's seen it, it's mainly been shown on the West Coast. You don't see it much on the East Coast. Or the Michael Phelps ad for Subway.
Oh.
Did not drop him. Go ahead.
Yeah, Subway, the contrapositive proves the rule here. Subway stopped, and at first the initial reports was that Subway was going to drop Michael Phelps as well. But they stepped back for a second, let Kellogg's, take a walk off the plank, right? And they saw what happened, and they did not get rid of Michael Phelps. They laid low for a couple of weeks. But yeah, I live out on the West Coast, and we started seeing these commercials for Jared, Jared, and Michael Phelps together. Sharing a meal, and the joke was Jared's eating the fit thing, and Michael Phelps, he's an athlete, so he's eating the big old sandwich with the meatballs and the marinara and all that. And the website for this campaign, SubwayFreshBuzz.com. So you think they're marketing to us? I've got a radio station, a rock radio station probably in any location where you live around the country will make some mention of 420. He brought up the 420 phenomenon. We had a character that would come on the radio station, a hazy moment with Randy. And the joke was, hey, dude, and it was the typical stereotypical stoner voice. But at the end of it, the little tagline is, Randy, can't live with them, can't shoot them. And every time I hear that, it kind of sends a chill down my spine. Like, okay, ha-ha, funny, we make a buck off of the stoner comedy. We make a buck off of weeds. We make a buck off all these other things. But yet there's still this underlying negative moral aspect to it sometimes. All right, so I want to go on and introduce William Lantelme from Brazil. And he's worked with growroom.net and also a lot of work on the marijuana marches and activism in Brazil. And I'm really excited that he's here because he gave a whole different perspective of what the fight is like in another country where they don't have the same kind of open cannabis culture that we have. So, William, what I was hoping is you could tell our audience here just a little bit of what it is like to be in the cannabis culture, what it is, and having to stay as underground as you need to be.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity of being here. I would like to thank OSI and DPA, especially Int'l, who made possible the coming of a group from Brazil. And yeah, the story in Brazil is very different than here. We have a big enforcement against drugs in Brazil. A lot of violence going on there because of drug traffic. A lot of people dying. Last year we built a network of 14 cities organizing the marijuana march in Brazil, and 3 days before it was prohibited in Salvador da Bahia, and afterwards all other cities were also prohibited. And just one city, Recife, was able to make the march. There was about 3,000 persons marching, and all other cities were prohibited. This year we came with attorneys who helped us to make the march possible, and some cities were still prohibited, but in Rio de Janeiro we were able to march. There was about 2,000 persons this year. We were able to make it, and other cities were still prohibited. And these cities continue fighting to make the march, and we won the right to make it now in Salvador da Bahia. And in the 5th December, we will be marching to demonstrate that we won the right to make it. A lot of lawyers were against that prohibition because if we are a democracy, we got to have the rights to march, to change the laws, and a lot of people accused us of supporting the crime because we were doing the march, but actually we were fighting for changing the laws, and they said we were supporting people to smoke marijuana. It was not the case. I was arrested because I was distributing flyers. It was ridiculous. They took us with about 1,500 flyers. In the coming day, there was the flyer printed in one of the biggest newspaper of Brazil with about 1,500,000 readers. It was so nice for us. It was not our strategy, but it worked.
Talk about your gas and media, yeah.
Yeah, but unfortunately, last year we were not able to make it. Now about growroom.net is a project that I began in 2002. It's a grower community. It was inspired in the instinct overgrow. Since 2002, more people is beginning to grow as an alternative for the traffic, because people is aware that in Brazil you have a lot of violence because of the traffic. Every day, every people that buys marijuana or cocaine, he's giving money to buy a weapon for a 15 years old children to be there selling and making security of other dealers. And every day in Rio and in São Paulo die more or less 20 persons in Brazil in these cities because of the war on drugs. So I think the growing culture in Brazil is a big punch in the traffic. I have friends, old friends that have childs, and they are planting their own grass now. And each day we have more people growing. What else?
But how about, I was wondering, in the situation that you're in where it's so prohibited, it's so restricted, and you're getting busted just for passing out flyers, how has the internet helped your community to grow? I mean, without it, it sounds like you'd be sunk.
Yeah, the community they are spreading also the news about the truth about marijuana. So all users of grow room, they are aware that growing marijuana is the best way than buying from the traffic, and we are spreading news also, making more a true talk about marijuana.
That's all you have?
What else?
Can I share something with you?
Yeah.
3 years ago, one of the Supreme Court justices from Brazil who ruled in favor of the change of the law, part of the culture, and this is a bittersweet thing, the United States government through the United States Information Agency brings people, distinguished professors and judges and nonprofit folks to the United States to learn and to spend a week and to interview people. Well, one of these Supreme Court justices came and he insisted that he wanted to speak to not only the drug czar's office, but NORML. And so I met with him and his translator, and he had just come from New York. And so he turns to me and he said, well, I was in Times Square, and for those familiar, when Weeds first came out, it had a billboard in Times Square that was probably 75 by 200 feet. It was a big baggie. It was a depiction of a baggie of marijuana with the characters in it and adorned with marijuana leaves. And so his first question was, if marijuana is illegal in the United States, why is that like the first image I saw? And after we talked about, I mean, really, I could give a dissertation answer to that kind of thing, but overall, he then was quite private about his own personal marijuana use as a graduate student. So I was not that surprised when that decision came down, that a man, a baby boomer, like I mentioned, he was about 52 or 53 years old at the time, came and saw something in the United States and apparently brought it back and convinced a majority on the court that there needs to be some reform.
Excellent. Well, thank you, William, and hit me down the We have about 13 or 14 minutes left to take questions from the audience. I think we're going to have, are we going to have a microphone, or we just have people speak up loud? Or they can get the wireless here. Okay. I'll just walk around. Thank you. So I'll start right over here. Why not? Question for our panel.
Okay. As far as the concern about this movement losing momentum, what do you think would cause that? Like, so that we can see it and stop it and get this thing cute like that.
What are the possible roadblocks we might face?
Well, a couple of things we've seen in the past is when there's a terrible tragedy from a celebrity or an athlete. I only have to use two words, lent bias. We completely, utterly stop drug policy in tracks. The second is that marijuana, as generally thought of as being not harmless, but pretty benign, and there are drugs like spice, if anybody's familiar with spice over in Europe, which is an analog of cannabis, as there are many analogs of cannabis that are going to make their way into the currently illegal market, which is why we need to have a legal market, as those drugs, which are much more potent than honey oil, make their way into the American black market, that can change the dynamic. Spice is the name of that drug.
Anyone else have a comment on the question?
The one thing that one of the things that I didn't really talk much about the clips, but one of the things that I think is important that I want people to think about is that at the same time that you have these messages that are laden with comedy, which is one of the few ways in which you can actually bring controversial topics into the mainstream in the U.S. without getting a lot of political pushback. So I kind of made a list of people who've done that, from Lenny Bruce to George Carlin, Richard Pryor, Bill Maher, Whoopi Goldberg, Robert Williams, Chris Rock. These people are comedians, but they're also social commentators. And in fact, because they can use comedy, that allows them to be a little bit more political than people who are not. But the thing I wanted to point to is that whether it's Weeds or Breaking Bad, which deals with meth, which I think that people should also watch, all of these shows have a subtext that involvement in drugs is personally corrupting. And so if you watch the show over time, while you have on the top this layer of comedy, underneath there's a layer of tragedy. And the main characters of these shows, and specifically the people who don't use drugs, who are there primarily for economic reasons, are portrayed as becoming more and more corrupt and inhumane and ruthless. And so I just think that that's something to pay attention to, because you're actually getting dual messages here.
Rubin has a statement
Yeah,
on
I mean, this really drives home a thought that if you're worried about it going a different direction, I mean, it's going to ebb and tide in general. So, I mean, you just got to recognize that's part of the game. I think that there needs to be appreciation for creating something where the undertone is normal. Like, that's the one thing I've walked away from, and I know it's definitely a plug, but in the same breath, it's a truism. It's like, I look at this, and my contribution that kind of came out of this whole experience is, I actually am like, okay, I'm going to do a feature film called 420, but it's not going to be a comedy. It's not going to focus on the marijuana usage as much as it's going to focus on 4 multicultural existences that happen to, by the way, in some form or fashion, engage in marijuana. But it's so passive that, aside from the subculture that he's very clearly stated knows the 420, it's going to go over the head of most other people, and they just think it's a cool title. And that's intentional, because it's not about me putting up a marijuana leaf. It's me showing an Arabic father who's struggling with a chronic back ailment, whose Arabic daughter is Americanized, and it becomes good gender conversation too. But oh, by the way, she's trying to convince the mother to introduce something that will help the chronic ailment of this father. And when it works, it's not a applaud moment. It's Dad's not as much of an asshole as he was last month, you know. Or to see a black couple, 20-something, and the reason why they might engage is because they're trying to cope with a society that has their foot deeply on their neck. And it's not meant to say, oh my God, he's a drug dealer and he has to run around and do anything crazy. Nah, he's just trying to get through his day. You know, there's a Latino couple in my mind that I'm going to create where they don't actually smoke weed, but there's an 80-year-old uncle. When they go to a quinceañera, they go to hang out with the family, and the 80-year-old uncle's like, why do you have a stick up your ass? And he's like, basically, because I'm trying to assimilate to this European lifestyle. Oh, by the way, the 80-year-old dad, the 80-year-old uncle smokes weed. But he's not saying you need to smoke. He's like, oh, really? I managed to get through this 80 years, and I'm okay. You can continue to be stuck, you know, who you are. And the whole point I'm trying to drive home is when she made the comment that there's this underlying pervasive attitude that comes out at some point, that's what I want to avoid. I want it to just be normal. I have an 80-year-old, I'm not Latino, but I have an 80-year-old uncle who's the coolest cat on earth. Smokes weed. And he's still okay. But in the same breath, as a high school teacher, I'm not going to say you need to go smoke weed, but I'm also not going to sit there and chastise you and destroy you for what has been proven to be okay. It's just how it's getting reintroduced, because I'm like, wow, what the hell is honey oil? Like, what the hell is, you know, this is going over my head, because I tell you, I am a square. But I am trying to show you that if you can get people to understand the value of media, why not create a storyline that is so matter of fact, like how Sex and the City introduced us to high-end shoe fashion. You didn't think of that as a very active choice, but I promise you, the high-end shoe fashion world knew who the hell they were targeting, and they made it clear. No, don't focus on it. Just make sure you see the shoes. And now suddenly you up their stock.
Make sure the word Manolo Blahnik is said.
Jimmy Choo.
You know, get your question. I did want to make a comment about the undertext that we see in the 420 in the culture and in the movies and the TV shows. Because when I catch an exception, it always sticks out to me. Now, this was a show that didn't go nowhere, but NBC put a remake of The Bionic Woman out. Okay, it was awful, terrible, lousy. But I happened to catch one portion of it where the Bionic Woman is picking up her daughter from school, and she's dragging her out of school, and she goes, Chelsea, I cannot believe you'd be so stupid to smoke weed behind the bleachers and get yourself busted. And that was it. There was no other mention in the entire show about that. There was no condemnation. It was more she was condemning her for being stupid for getting caught than the weed smoking itself. It kind of stuck out to me. Now, I get to your question.
Thank you.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. I just want to add something. I'm Brazilian too, and I was seeing Rubin saying, and I just want to add some things that are happening in Brazil that he didn't mention, is that we had now a very important movement about marijuana culture in Brazil. I think it's grown a lot in the last 2 years. We had all started with Psychotropos, which is our organization and our slogans and our way of trying to bring the drug policy reform and marijuana movement to the mainstream debate, into the politicians and the media. And also it's very important that the young people are doing many blogs and many sites on the web and alternative media to show how marijuana use can be normalized in our society too. So this has been growing a lot. And in the last year, as you may have known, we had our former president, Cardoso, that stands for marijuana decriminalization. And this brought to the media, very huge media attention for the issue. So the big media covered about this on the main TV shows. And so everybody started to talk about marijuana in our society. And when they prohibited the marijuana march, it was in our favor because it grew so much in the media because it was prohibited. And in a democratic country, like we like to say we are, it's impossible to prohibit something that you are fighting for a discussion, a debate. So that was a big deal for us. So that's what I want to tell you some more about also an initiative that the government, we have a deputy congressman that is introducing a bill that will regulate the cultivation, and maybe we can get the criminalization law that will permit the cultivation, self-cultivation of marijuana, which would enhance a lot the movement, and we hope that this passes in Congress and the government supports it, because we think it's a way to undermine the drug trafficking process and our drug war, because this is a big deal for us.
Our next speaking line about this woman here, Deborah and Chris, and then if we have enough time, I'll get some more.
This is just to respond to Deborah's comment. Watching Weeds, that undercurrent of negativity, in my view, is always related not to the weed, it's related to the prohibition. It's always, almost every negative consequence that I've seen in Weeds is relating to the consequences of prohibition, not the consequences of the substance. And I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Well, I would just point out that in the clip I showed of Mary Louise Parker talking about her role, she assumes that because the mother is involved in drug trafficking that she's not a good mother. It's one of the things that made the role attractive to her. There's no pushback that in the value judgment about what that says about a woman as a mother who would also involve herself and her kids in drug trafficking. That's number one. Number two is that if you watch over the period of the show, I'll never forget the way they ended the first season with that sort of Godfather-like shot of her presiding over her trafficking network. Okay, that was very intentional to reinforce the association between her and the Godfather. And that's another way of enforcing this idea of drug activity being corrupting to the person. And that's not about prohibition. I mean, it is, but it isn't. I mean, we know that it is. But in terms of how it filters out into the world, there's this element. And if you watch Breaking Bad, it's also interesting. The same thing is there. And what I found interesting in both places is that it's the people who are not using drugs that are perceived as being less humane, who are more willing to engage in violence, who are more willing to be corrupted by the money. Okay? And again, I mean, I don't know how much of that was conscious choice on the part of the writers, but given how intelligent they are, I have to think that it was. And it's where the actors are allowing their judgments about the characters that they're playing to be filtered through the way in which they play them. And so again, I mean, it doesn't make me not want to watch the show, because I feel that part of advocacy is understanding how things are being addressed in the culture so that you can have your advocacy be reflective of that. But for me, as I watched it more and more, I couldn't help but notice that underlying subtext of corruption. And for me, what would be useful inside of what you were talking about, Rubin, is to have a show where you parallel people who were involved in the drug business with people who were working on Wall Street and see which group is more corrupt.
Absolutely. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I have to get to my last two questions. Des has a question.
Hi. Couple of things. First of all, I vividly remember the meth girl commercials, and I remember that was the first time I ever wanted to do it. So it never had an interest for me, but so sometimes the anti-ads reverberate. Also, I wanted to ask you about the backlash that happens, because I know, like you talked about the arrests and things going up. How much of that is the law enforcement feeling the loss of control as, you know, citizens don't report their neighbors for pot. It's become normalized. So how much of that backlash of loss of control are they exerting out there and trying to push back? And is that a good thing or bad thing for us?
And before you answer, just so I can make sure I get both questions that I promised to answer, I'll let you get your question too, and then we can throw to both of the questions.
Okay, well, I'm Chris Conner with the West Coast League, and we play it very straight on the marijuana issue, and it's kind of tough because, you know, everyone's like sending their like in jokes and so forth, and I think this is kind of, I'm really relating back to what Deborah was saying here, is that this whole concept, irony doesn't really play out on the subconscious level, and a lot of this stuff, it's like, even in the show like Bored to Death, which is relatively positive, all the while they're supposed to be positive, saying, oh, this is terrible, blah, 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 let alone something like Weeds, which is a great show, but their message about marijuana is hideous. And it turned out that moment there when she became, all of a sudden it's got international gangs and tunnels underneath the country and all this hideous stuff, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the marijuana use that I see and so forth. And so I think that the problem with our movement is we think humor and irony and these subtexts are all going to get through, and they don't. Because everybody else is looking at it from the point of view, oh, they are bad. Oh, everybody who uses marijuana cannot succeed. They can't get across through. They're all going to get busted, blah, blah, blah. And it's this horrible, horrible thing, which I see going with weeds, although I'd love to show you. But now to get to the question part of it, which is that I think one of the issues we have is we have this faux cannabis culture, which is that, and I love hippies and I love, all this stuff, and rainbow gatherings and so forth. But I would say that marijuana doesn't just have a culture of subcultural use. We have an over-the-counter culture as well, which is the business people. And on top of that, we have those people who have become acculturated into just being an American who happens to smoke pot. And they don't feel like they're part of this big culture and this big movement. They just happen to smoke pot, and they don't get busted, and so they don't feel the connection. So I'm wondering about how does the media make that reach to those people rather than putting them off with the stuff that we're seeing.
Okay. So we have Des's question, which to restate had to do with the arrest going after the pushback, and then Chris's question. Did you guys go ahead?
I'm going to sum up the whole increase in arrest with what I said earlier. It's still capitalism. I know that's going to spark a whole other controversy, but if you have any idea about who's getting arrested, and I'm not even the policy guy. This is observation from being in the streets. You need to fill up prisons. They're there for a reason. So regardless of who's calling it in, when New York is 70,000 people getting arrested for 40,000? I mean, it's a business. I'm sorry. I hate to not have a great other answer, but it's just a business. And it's not going to change until that need for that business changes. On the topic of how there are two cultures, I'm gonna sum up my own experience with this, my favorite quote, beatnik, Allen Ginsberg. Whoever controls the images controls the mind. Right now, they're teeter-tottering. There is an opportunity to get in the door, and they're happy to be in the door, but the reality is they don't know if they're welcome. And I'm talking about all the isms that are not in control over the media. So if you are in media and you allowed yourself to get involved with subject matter like marijuana, for instance, you might have to go comedy, you might have to go irony in order to get in the door. But you guys are in the door. We're in the door. The question is, are you going to still continue to encourage comedy? Are you going to still encourage let's turn it into Sopranos? Or are you going to say, you know what, it's just normal? Because that's the one thing that I heard is like, why not it be a story about somebody who doesn't have any major conspiracy, who is just figuring out, should I go to this pharmacist who has my medicinal, who can fill my medicinal marijuana for a generic price of $4, or do I go across the state, across the city? So I mean, there are many ways that we can tackle it, but a lot of times, media operates off of what bleeds. What bleeds leads and all the things. I mean, even from a filmmaker perspective, they want me to make sex, money, and violence or comedy as my movie. Because I'm a black guy and I'm supposed to know a whole lot about that. I want to do something on an elderly couple and I'm not elderly yet. Hey, so control your media. And you guys are in that position more than you probably realize because you're the consumer of it. So just think in the context of what do you want to see, and that'll probably at some point resonate. Anyone else with a quick response to those?
Well, the issue of arrest, again, on the arrest issue, what's fascinating to me is a couple of things. One is that if you look nationally on arrest rates for drugs in general, I always like to bring this out to people when I speak at student groups, etc., that more than 80% of all drug law enforcement is for possession offenses. Possession offenses, which means we're talking about small amounts of drugs. Now, half of that is just for marijuana. But overall, the drug war is not fought against big traffickers, people involved with large amounts of drugs. It's really about people with small amounts of drugs. So when you understand that, then you have to ask, okay, so then why are we arresting people? Clearly we're not doing that because we think it's going to have an impact on the drug economy. Okay? Because if you pick up somebody with a joint, $10, $20, even $100 worth of weed, that's nothing. Okay? This is not about that. This is about economic exclusion, oppression, and control. And what bugs me, and I'll just leave with this thought, the thing that bugs me and I worry about with regard to this cultural change that we're in is the degree to which Americans are willing to allow for a scenario where adults like Carrie and her friends, can smoke weed with little trouble. They didn't show their arrest. In their scenario, they didn't go down and get fingerprinted and strip searched and stuck into a nasty cell for 2 days, which is what actually happens to people. You just saw her in the cop car with the cop saying, "I'm sorry, I have to arrest you," and the next scene, she's having lunch with her friends, like it was no big deal. So one of the things I'm kind of worried about is that, and in weeds, these guys have never been arrested by the police, even though they are moving large amounts of drugs. They've had interactions with the police, but they've not been arrested.
They've turned other people.
Yes, exactly, but not them. And so the thing that I worry about, and I want all of us to be thinking about, is that the worst outcome, from my point of view, is that we could end up with a situation where adults, particularly affluent adults, particularly people who have connections, and this is not about being black or white, because if you've got money in America, you can do drugs, okay, period. You know, whatever color you are. But where the people who are going to end up paying the cost for our drug policies are going to continue to be young people, primarily young people of color. And while we say that we're doing it because we want to protect them and we don't want them to end up addicts, it has nothing to do with that. It's like what I personally have a problem with the idea of sacrificing generation after generation of black and Hispanic youth in order to maintain the illusion of protecting white youth. And if that's not the country that we want,
we're out of time. We've got a lot more time to talk about these things. Before we go, don't forget to fill out your evaluation for the panel. And please join me in thanking William Lantelme.
Thank you for downloading the NORML Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. We are produced by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. Our executive producer is Alan St. Pierre. Our deputy director is Paul Armentano. Our webmaster is Brian Judy. And web production is provided by Red Aphid Interactive Media. As always, you can catch up on the latest information about marijuana at www.norml.org. And you can interact and download from our Audio Stash blog at stash.norml.org. For everyone here at NORML, I'm your host, Radical Russ Belville, hoping all your harvests are bountiful and your encounters with law enforcement are non-existent. We leave you today with a reminder to check out NORML Show Live tomorrow night, Saturday night, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be broadcasting live from the Oregon NORML Cannabis Cafe, the first of its kind in the Pacific Northwest, or as far as we know, anywhere in America. It's not a dispensary, it's not a lounge, it's for patients only, and they enjoy the camaraderie of each other while being able to enjoy a vapor bar or the occasional bowl. It's run by Oregon NORML, and we'll be bringing you all the information about it tomorrow and taking your calls in front of our live audience there at the Cannabis Cafe. Thanks for downloading the podcast. It's been an exhausting and fun weekend, and until next time, take care of each other, tokers.